Thank you, sir. I'm looking forward to asking questions. And just so you know, after we've asked a few and Dr. Kukla's been able to express some things, we are going to have a time for questions from the audience as well. So as we talk, keep in mind if there's anything you'd like to ask. So I know you saw on the invitation that a lot of things happened in June 1776. And I'm excited to start off with the first question. It's going to be about Patrick Henry, the first governor of Virginia. Now, I don't know how many of you realize this. I actually realized it working on these questions, but tomorrow, June 29th, 250th anniversary of Patrick Henry becoming the first governor of Virginia. To the day, he was inaugurated and elected all in one fell swoop. And I actually have a quote, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Kukla. This quote I came across in a book. It's from the prologue of The Christian Philosophy of Patrick Henry by J. Wells. And this is such an astounding statement, and that's why I wanted to read it as we kick this off. Before July 2nd, 1776, the date of the final vote in the Continental Congress on the question of independence, Virginia had already declared her independence from England, framed her Constitution, drafted her Bill of Rights, and elected Patrick Henry her first governor. Thus, he became the first elected governor of a free republic under a written constitution in the history of the world. I hope you got goosebumps. God bless America. That I thought was such a wonderful thing. So, Dr. Kukla, feel free to discuss Patrick Henry's time as governor. Was his time considered a success? All that sort of thing.
I think let's start with the events of June 250 years ago, because as you just indicated, 250 years ago tomorrow, the Constitution, the first Constitution of the Commonwealth, was adopted. Principal authorship of that was George Mason of Gunston Hall, a man that Patrick Henry and Mason and Henry are virtual political soulmates. They see things in the same light from the beginning all the way through. Both of them end up being critics of the Constitution that came out of the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. Mason participated in that convention and declined to sign the Constitution, and his principal opposition to the Constitution was, as he wrote in a pamphlet at the time, there is no Bill of Rights. And so he and Henry were like soulmates. Henry had been involved in the convention that wrote the Constitution, and interestingly, among the things that he fought for rather unsuccessfully was he warned in the convention debates that he thought that the powers of the governor were not sufficient for the responsibilities that were going to fall to the governor. But prior to the adoption of the Constitution on the 29th, if we go back a couple weeks, on the 12th, Virginia adopted the Declaration of Rights, which is a hugely important document in American history. It becomes the forerunner of the Bill of Rights to the federal Constitution. It's a forerunner of the Declaration of the Rights of Man in the French Revolution, and I think sometimes in the 1960s there was a UN Universal Declaration of Rights. It's the forerunner of all of those things. And one of the things that I think is most interesting about the way Virginia did these two documents is that for the first time, this would have been back in May 250 years ago, there was a guy named Meriwether Smith from Essex County who was in the convention and moved that the convention go about creating a statement of rights and a written constitution. And in a very real way, I've been trying to, I've been pestering my fellow historian colleagues and stuff as to whether they can find anywhere in history a prior instance in which somebody was putting together the idea of, first we need to state what the rights are of humanity that need to be protected, and then we need to pair that with a plan of government. The Virginians actually didn't use the term Constitution very much yet in 1776. They referred to it as the plan of government. At any rate, that pairing of those two things, that we're going to define the rights that need to be protected, both individual and the rights of society, and such, and then pair that with a small r Republican form of government. I think that's the first unique time in history that happened as well. And the Declaration of Rights, I think, are just phenomenally important, not only for the things like religious liberty or freedom of the press or the right to bear arms and those kinds of things, but also because one of the things that Mason did, and Henry and James Madison had roles in the writing of the Virginia Declaration of Rights as well. One of the things that they did is they not only outlined what people's rights were, but they describe what the responsibilities are of a citizen of a Republican society and government. Rights are one thing, but it comes with responsibilities, and they spoke to that in a way that I found significant and eloquent. But you asked about Henry. Henry was elected, and then very quickly came down with something. We're not sure what it was. There were times in his life when he was a bit susceptible to illness. We're not sure what. Some people speculate that that he may have been inclined to suffer in the dampness of Williamsburg and such, and even possibly that malaria was involved or whatever. But he ended up soon after his election as governor. He ended up sick in bed and came here to Scotchtown, and so spent the first several months of his governorship in Scotchtown, where he was visited by there was a convention in, I want to say, August or thereabouts. There was a convention of Baptist churches who met in Hanover, and they came and met with Governor Henry, and essentially an important deal was made. At that time, of course, the Commonwealth, the former colony, the established church was the Anglican Church, the Church of England, and it was supported by taxes, by tithes. And in addition to its what we would recognize as its religious role, for church services and baptisms and funerals and weddings and all those sorts of aspects. In addition to that, the parish vestry was really the smallest unit of local government, and it had responsibility for looking after orphans and for for the you know, the insane or the or the impoverished, and all of these sort of charitable social functions. It also it was the vestry that had a role in determining landlines. Every couple of years they would do this thing called processioning, which basically meant that everybody in a neighborhood would walk the property lines to make sure that, you know, the markers were, you know, if it was a rock or a tree or whatever it was that was to make sure that everybody knew what the properties were and stuff, as a way, you know, good fences make good neighbors. Well, good property lines make good neighbors as well. So the established church there were members of the established church. Henry was not one of them, but there were members of the established church who were really hard on what they regarded as dissenters, particularly in Hanover. That would have been Presbyterians and Baptists. To a lesser extent, there were some Quakers in the more northerly parts of the Commonwealth. But Henry entertained a deputation from this group of Baptists, and the deal that was struck is that he, as governor, would promote and help to make possible Baptist chaplains to accompany recruits to the army to fight. Virginia sent a lot of men up to fight and support Washington. And so in exchange for the Baptist ministers helping with the recruiting, Henry gave his promise, and made good on it next time the legislature met, of enabling the Baptist clergymen to accompany the troops as chaplain. So, you know, I think there's, to my mind, there's a perfect example of Henry at work, you know, sort of pragmatically solving a problem, and then characteristically with generosity toward people of the dissenting faiths. Henry was. I may be trespassing on one of your questions,
it's okay.
But Henry's family, the religious history of Henry's family is really fascinating. You know, his father, John, graduated from the University of Aberdeen about 1718 or thereabouts, and came to Virginia by 1730. He was here in Virginia. Henry's uncle, who was older than John, his namesake uncle Patrick, was an Anglican minister. Had studied at Aberdeen and at Marischal College, and also in Aberdeen. So he was an Anglican pastor. He probably would have called himself a priest. He seems, during the Parsons cause, he was among those who was trying to get paid, and seems to have been chummy with James Maury, who was the neighboring pastor who was the plaintiff in the Parsons cause, and also was in correspondence with John Cam, who was the minister in Yorktown, and was one of the major. He was a sort of thorn in the side of Governor Fauquier and others, and very much he was the. John Cam was the man who wrote most of the pamphlets upholding the clergy point of view in the Parsons cause dispute. So he's a sort of inclined to be a high churchman, the kind of guy who really isn't certainly he doesn't want to listen to a vestry. He doesn't really want to listen to, well, frankly, he doesn't want to listen to anybody at all except his view of what God has told him to do. So though, he would definitely have seen himself as an Anglican priest, with all the kind of that sort of, to the extent that one could do it, that sort of high church thing. Now, Henry's father was, I'd say, sort of inclined in that direction. Apparently had a reputation for being a really dull preacher. And there is one snippet of a sermon of his that survives. It was a funeral sermon that he delivered, and there's a copy at the Virginia Historical Society in Richmond, and it does look like dull stuff.
Okay.
Kind of tough to
Proved
read.
his point.
Henry's mother was a follower of Samuel Davies, a Presbyterian evangelist who had made Hanover his base in the 1750s, and Davies was one of Davies died young after he left Hanover, came to Hanover in the very late 40s, I believe, early 50s. 1750s, and then got hired away to be the president of what's now Princeton. It was then the College of New Jersey, and it was a Presbyterian-related college in New Jersey. So he got hired away for that, and then died up there. But he was basically ranked with George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards as the three most eloquent evangelical preachers in the 18th century. And so the story goes that Henry's mother went to worship at Polgreen, and that typically on the way back, on the ride back, she had Patrick Henry and his brothers. She'd quiz them about the sermon, so he learned to listen carefully. But there's no question, everybody who's written about Henry is agreed that Samuel Davies was the example of oratory that influenced Henry's development as a speaker. And there's an interesting passage in one of Samuel Davies' sermons, and the sermons have been published, and frankly, I think are still in print. I think there are still modern, editions that you can find. But in one of his sermons, he talks about the way he sees his responsibility as a preacher, and he sees it not as one trying to make an argument for this, that, or the other theological position or whatever, but not to make an argument, but rather to speak to the heart and to persuade in that way, rather than, and in some ways that, of course, is exactly what we see in Henry's, not only his political oratory, but also in Henry's abilities, his talent and his great success as an attorney, because he could basically in the county court, faced with 6 or a dozen Virginia farmers, he could find a way to persuade them to look with favorably toward his client, and that became a very lucrative profession for him. So he had those. He had, the Presbyterian inclined mother. His father was a member of the vestry here in Hanover, and his uncle was a Anglican clergyman. And then Henry had it's really interesting. Starting in the mid 1760s, when he's going to the meetings of the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg, he gets approached by a guy named Robert Pleasance, and it's the same family as the hardware store in Richmond. And Robert Pleasance is a Quaker. And so Henry begins this essentially dialogue and relationship with Pleasance that continues roughly into about 1790. So there's an almost certainly quarter of a century relationship between the two of them. And at various points in the 1780s, Henry does some legal work for Pleasance. He's got this very interesting relationship with the Quakers. The Quakers in the 18th century are starting to become the kind of sedate people that we think of when you think of the guy on the Quaker Oats box, right? But particularly in the 17th century, in England and in the colonies, the Quakers because part of what the Quakers believed in was a sort of inner light, which meant that no church could control it, and as far as sort of respectable English gentry felt, these were wild men. these people were crazy, and so there's some evidence among the Quaker groups up in Fairfax County and northern part of Virginia. Some of the Quakers that wandered down from Pennsylvania there had a little bit more of this sort of wild temperament, one of the things that's so interesting about Robert Pleasance is that Pleasance and a couple of others basically took it upon themselves to lobby, if you will, the members of the General Assembly, and the Quakers, of course, were one of the earliest groups that were developing arguments against the existence of slavery, and ultimately the earliest abolitionist movements come out of the Quakers, and Henry was talking with Pleasance about that, and so one of the things that we have is there's a letter. It's been reprinted lots and lots of times. The original, I believe it's the best original copy, is actually in a Quaker library in London. But it's a letter from Henry. This is in 1773, and you've probably seen references to this. It's a letter in which Henry talks about slavery to Pleasance, and the situation is that Pleasance has sent Henry a book that's kind of an anti-slavery pamphlet, and Henry's acknowledging the receipt of the pamphlet, thanking Pleasance for it, and then goes on to comment about how even in this enlightened age, there are people who who are willing to put up with slavery, and how startling it is that even I, Henry says, have slaves of my own purchase, which is the phrase of all this letter. It's one of the phrases that I find most revealing. If you were Nathaniel Harrison VI, you could claim that the slaves were you had inherited them. What am I going to do, right? Henry has none of that. Slaves of my own purchase. I can't justify it. Slavery is abhorrent. It can't be justified on religious or political, philosophical purposes. it's wrong, and yet here we are. And he refers to what he actually uses the language of the general inconvenience of living without them. Well, I mean, when you look at the labor force in 18th century Virginia, this is a pretty major part of the. I think by 1770, something like 40% of the population in Eastern Virginia is enslaved. So that's a real presence. But anyway, so he's got that, and then the final wrinkle on his again is his relationship with the Baptists, and Henry. And again, I guess many of these denominations are much more sedate in our century than they were in the 18th. There was a particular the people who got the evangelical or dissenting groups that got in trouble with the law in the 18th century were those that were unwilling to commit themselves to a particular church or meeting house. One of the great reasons that Samuel Davies was so successful is that he went to the governor and council in Williamsburg and basically registered and got the license from the colonial government to set up 6 meeting houses. And for the Anglican sort of gentlemen who were concerned about the rabble and such, committing to a fixed location rather than wandering around, that was a sign of civility and good order and all of these sorts of things. So what happened in late 60s is that, and early 70s, is that there was a particular stripe, if you will, of Baptists that called themselves the separate Baptists, and they were of the. I should pause and say, I grew up and still see myself as a Lutheran, and just kind of amused by all the ways in which in which we find ways to not only worship the Lord but chastise one another for our failings and differences and all that sort of thing. But the separate Baptists, these were guys, and they were mostly men, evangelical preachers. They were wandering around, and from their point of view, the very best thing they could happen was to be persecuted, just like the saints under the Romans, and to be scourged and whipped or whatever. This was an indication of the strength of their faith, which leads you into kind of a tendency toward conflict. And so there were Anglican politicians and clergymen. Notably up in Caroline County, Edmund Pendleton, who was a contemporary of Henry's, was basically persecuting the Baptists. And Archibald Carey, who was another contemporary and very prominent member, I think he became, under the new government, he became the Speaker of the Senate. And in Chesterfield County, he too was leading the persecution of the Baptists, and it was happening up in Spotsylvania and in Orange, and basically these guys were being thrown in jail. And the famous story is that Henry, we don't have much written direct. Henry would basically pay their bail, which wasn't entirely popular, with the independent Baptists because it sort of like mitigated the martyrdom, you know? And sometimes they'd rather have stayed in jail. There's stories of them preaching through the jail windows and all these kind of things. But Henry would basically either pay their bail or go into court. And one of the best stories that's been written down is him going into court and asking what are the charges, and they told that that this man is preaching without a license and itinerant and such. And Henry's response was, well, what? He's being accused of preaching the gospel of Christ, and he got him off. Yeah. So there's Henry's and the one final wrinkle on Henry's religious sort of world is that his or two final wrinkles. One is to point out that, of course, in England. Or in Great Britain, in England it was the established church was the Church of England. In Scotland it's the Presbyterian Kirk, and yet in Scotland, Henry's father and uncle were Anglicans. So in the context of Scotland, they're in the minority. They're the dissenters. The other I think interesting wrinkle on this is that Henry's sister, known to history as Madame Russell, becomes one of the major converts to the Methodists in the 1780s, and so the religious spectrum of all this kind of wonderful diversity among the Henry family is I just think it speaks to a deep sense of tolerance and a deep embrace of religious liberty. He was less he was much harder on deism, and particularly by the 1790s, where as happened in America in the 1790s in general, the example of the bloodshed of the French Revolution and the execution of the king and queen and the reign of terror and the murders by guillotine and so on, that horrified Henry, and he regarded that as being a characteristic of the sort of that's what happens if you embrace deism. And so, Henry was always a little bit suspicious of Jefferson's religious views.
I've actually got a quote here, Patrick Henry from Wart Sketches on deism. The view which the rising greatness of our country presents to my eyes is greatly tarnished by the general prevalence of deism, which, with me, is but another name for vice and depravity.
Yeah.
That's a strong statement.
Yeah. That's characteristic of his perspective, and there were just when you look at events in the 1790s, that's one of those periods of great political division in the nation, and part of it is exacerbated by the fact that. If you were a Federalist and I was a Jeffersonian and we're looking at each other, if I'm the Jeffersonian, you, Alexander Hamilton, are a monocrat and secretly, in cahoots with the kings, and you're looking at me and seeing, Robespierre and some murderous Jacobins who were stringing up nobility and stuff. And there's this tendency for in the 1790s particularly for emotions to be just exacerbated by this, you know, cataclysmic stuff that's going on in Europe, which is, you know, not only the French Revolution but all the wars that come with it. And so whenever you look at politics in the 1790s, you've got to factor in the you know, the Federalists basically saw themselves as kind of allied with England, and the group that becomes the Jeffersonians sort of saw themselves as allying with you know, with France in this revolutionary world. It's in much the same way. I think it's the kind of us-them sort of stuff that was characteristic of the attitudes in the Cold War, in you know, in the 20th century. So.
Very good. You know, with the 4th coming up, want to go back to the Declaration of Independence? Got a question about that, just since it's upon us.
Sure.
I've got this note here, a question. Drafting of the Declaration of Independence on June 11th, 1776, the Continental Congress appoints a committee of 5 to draft Declaration of Independence. And I've got the names. That was John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin, Pennsylvania, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, of course, Robert Livingston of New York, and Roger Sherman. Can you talk to us about the interactions of those men with Patrick Henry? Particularly, I would think John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, we know some about, and Benjamin Franklin. But as they were drafting that, what type of interactions,
I mean,
relationships?
Virginia is in the front of the motion of the movement toward independence. I think it was in May, 250 years ago, that the Virginia's convention sends word to its delegates in the Continental Congress, instructing them to move for independence. And so I believe it's May 15th in Congress in Philadelphia, that Richard Henry Lee, who is the sort of senior member of the Virginia delegation to Congress, makes his motion, and the motion that he introduces is in fact what is adopted on July 2nd, and the language of his motion is, you know, is part of the Declaration of Independence, and it essentially, you know, that henceforth it is of right and ought to be that these colonies are free and independent states, and so on. And so that, you know, that motion is on the table in Congress, and basically what has to happen is the various delegations have to get permissions from their, you know, from the powers that be at home to vote for independence. The Americans recognize this is a big step, and we want to make sure that you know, that we're all together. I think it was Franklin Roosevelt said something like, the worst thing that a leader can do is look behind him and see that there's nobody there. You know, so you want to make sure that you've you know, that everybody's going into this together. So there's that period of some months, and the committee, as you indicated, meets and starts working on a Declaration of Independence, and then they basically decide that Jefferson is the best writer, and so let him draft the thing, and ultimately he introduces his draft of the Declaration, and Congress edits it in many small ways. One of the most substantial changes is that Jefferson has a long long paragraph of denouncing the slave trade and blaming George III for responsibility for encouraging the slave trade. That's a little bit exaggerated, but it is true that the Virginians, particularly in the 1770s, had tried to end the slave trade, not necessarily to end slavery, but to end the slave trade. So there's there's core of truth, and at any rate, folks from South Carolina and Georgia were not going to put up with that, and so that paragraph had to go. There were other changes made. Jefferson is, I think, probably throughout his life or certainly in those early years of his life, was kind of thin-skinned about these things. Franklin tells, Jefferson complains to Franklin that they're ruining my text. They're changing things. They're changing the wording and all. And as an author, this isn't something that's fun when it's being done in a committee setting or whatever. And Franklin takes an opportunity to sort of comfort Jefferson with his story about. It's one of these sort of shaggy dog stories that Franklin is capable of telling to make his point. A friend of his who had a sign. He was a hat maker, and it was Joseph Smith, hat maker, makes hats for sale for ready money, with a picture of a hat subjoined. Okay, so this is the sign that this guy wants to have made, and somebody says, well, everybody knows that you're going to sell them, so you don't need that, and everybody knows it's going to be for ready money. You don't need that, and everybody knows you're a hat maker. You don't need that, and so finally the sign is finished, as Franklin is telling Jefferson. So finally the sign is finished, and it says Joseph Smith with a figure of a hat subjoined. Everything else has been edited away. But Adams again, he was part of that committee, but Adams is one of the ones whose diary or a letter to Abigail, or one or the other, indicates that he's the one from whom we know that they gave it to Jefferson because he was the better writer. Let's see. Sherman is doesn't really figure much. Dickinson, was it Dickinson?
Livingston, Robert.
Oh,
Livingston.
Livingston.
New York. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Part
Livingston.
of the original five.
Yeah. I mean, basically, what you've got there is a powerhouse committee that represents all the important colonies, and by participating in it, they're lending the weight of their political clout to the motion for independence. One of the curious things about the Declaration of Independence, as we now celebrate it, is, as I indicated, that motion that Richard Henry Lee had introduced was actually voted on in Congress on July 2nd. And then, of course, the Declaration of Independence is voted on the 4th. Well, on the evening of the 2nd, John Adams goes back to his lodgings and writes a letter to Abigail, his wife, just declaiming how wonderful it is. We've declared independence, and for decades hence, the 2nd of July will be celebrated with fireworks and pomp, ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. And of course, what has happened is that the Declaration, which has a different purpose, the Declaration is stated in the purpose, is that when in the course of human events it becomes necessary, a proper respect to mankind, that you should explain yourself and so on. That's what the Declaration is, but the actual legal, vote for separation happened on the 2nd. But Jefferson's explanation for why we were doing this, and of course part of the major part of the Declaration, when you actually read it, is all the bad things that George III was responsible for, and why we want to get rid of a king. But I always get a kick out of the fact that John Adams was absolutely sure that Americans would be celebrating the 2nd of July for centuries to come.
Right. We would. What about Patrick Henry's interaction with any of those men during the writing? Any thoughts on that?
Henry had been a member of the First Continental Congress, and played a rather prominent role in a couple of its transactions. There's a wonderful story told by a man named Charles Thompson, who is he's a local kind of revolutionary leader in Philadelphia. He's among other things, he's the one responsible for getting the first Congress to meet in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. Thompson is a little bit more radical than John Dickinson. If it had been John Dickinson's way, they would have met in the State House. But he gets them to meet. Essentially, it's in a Union Hall. That's what we're, the Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. But Thompson talks about how there's this rustic-looking guy who stands up. He's standing up to speak, and Thompson is just he is prepared for this fellow to embarrass himself, because he looks, as Thompson read, he looks like a country parson, plainly dressed, and Thompson hasn't a clue as to who it is. And it turns out this is Patrick Henry, and as soon as he starts speaking, he bowls them over. Henry in the First Continental Congress, one of his arguments was to the effect that the distinctions between us have been erased. There is no longer a Pennsylvanian or a Virginian or a New Yorker. We are all Americans. Now, that kind of, he's got that kind of rhetoric. There's other moments. He's involved in writing one of the letters to the king, which is a little bit too radical, and it gets toned down, And finally, in the interests of unanimity, they give it to John Dickinson, who ultimately is much more conservative and much more reluctant for independence and such. But when the Second Continental Congress is meeting, Henry is back in Williamsburg. He and Mason and others are busily drafting the Virginia Declaration of Rights and the state constitution. And Jefferson, when you read Jefferson's correspondence at that point, Jefferson just really wished he could be in two places at one time. He's stuck in Philadelphia, assigned to write the Declaration of Independence, which of course is going to make him world famous. But if he'd had his druthers, he'd probably have been back in Williamsburg, where they were writing the Constitution, and he regarded that as being, sort of the more important job. So he actually tries to send a draft Constitution from from Philadelphia to Williamsburg. It gets there way too late for them to do anything except take its preface and stick it at the beginning of the document that Mason wrote.
Right.
Yeah.
What do you think about Patrick Henry and Americans today? How do you think, from all your study and compiling all these things, Patrick Henry will want Americans, us today, to think about the American Revolution?
He actually left us. He left us a message, and it's Henry was living at Red Hill, where he's now buried, at the time of his death, and he left 2 documents in his law office there at Red Hill. One was his last will and testament, which does all the things that it's supposed to do, and divvies up his property and such, and makes a statement to his family to the effect that this is all I can distribute to you, but sort of keep the faith. Your faith in Jesus Christ will make you rich indeed. So that's the message to the family. Next to it is a slip of paper. The document itself is now down in the archives at Colonial Williamsburg, and you can see it on their website. And on one side of it, he transcribed his, by memory, his resolutions against the Stamp Act, which at this time, in the 1790s, the Americans regarded that as basically the beginning of the revolution. So on one side, there's his resolution of the Stamp Act. On the other side is a note really to posterity. Reader, whoever thou art, it starts. And he talks about the importance of practicing virtue. He poses the question whether the revolution will be a good thing or a bad thing. And he says, and the answer is whether posterity, whether the citizens will act with wisdom or act in folly, and depending on how citizens conduct themselves in the future, the revolution will either be a good thing or it will be a disaster, a catastrophe. And so he closes with the phrase, reader, whoever thou art, in thy life, practice virtue and encourage it in others. And there's a very real sense. We know what Henry and his contemporaries meant by virtue, and the reason we know that is because they spelled it out in the Declaration of Rights, the responsibilities and characteristics of toleration, religious liberty, sympathy toward one another, and so on. There are all of these civic virtues that basically they're saying this is the way you need to conduct yourself as a citizenry, and if you do that, the revolution will be a good thing, and if you don't, it'll be a mess.
I think I'm recalling part of that quote was, it's actually Proverbs, righteousness alone can exalt a nation.
Yes, righteousness alone can exalt a nation.
So it's
yes.
a pretty stern and timely message
yeah.
to this day.
Yes,
So.
yes, yeah.
Well, I think we're going to switch now to questions. Bob, are you going to have a microphone?
I do.
When you do that? So you can probably see better than me. I know there's beautiful faces out there, but I see more like us. So if you have a question, put your hand up, and Bob's going to bring the microphone to you, and Dr. Kukla will entertain your question.
Anybody have a question?
What part of the young Patrick Henry, what changed him to become what he became? What is there a certain point of his life? Why didn't he grow up to be a farmer, or just a businessman? What pushed him?
Yeah, good question. How did he come to choose to the career he had? I think we looked back on it and I've been emphasizing, of course, in all of his involvement in civic life and politics. His real profession, he was a lawyer. He was a trial lawyer. And there are plenty of stories that indicate that, that not only was he good at it, but he had some of the tricks of a trial lawyer. One of my very favorite stories on that score is the time that apparently he forgot which side he was supposed to be arguing. And so his client is getting increasingly restive and he finally gets Henry's attention, and Henry realizes that he's just been arguing against his client's best interests, and it turns on a dime and says, "Well, these are the arguments that learned counsel will be giving in a few minutes." And then he went on to argue the other side, and and then there's the one in which a guy was accused of stealing a shoat. A shoat is it's bigger than a suckling pig, but it's not a full-size pig. So he'd been accused of stealing it. So before they go into the county court, Henry arranges for him to have this pig cut in half and put half of it in Henry's smokehouse. This, of course, is getting him his fee, but it also enables him, when the court case comes up, to say, "That man has no more of a pig in his possession than I have in mine." So, but basically, Henry grew up. His father married well. This is actually a secret to a lot of our founders. Washington married well. Jefferson married well. It's a kind of a litany of, you want to get a leg up in the world, marry a rich widow. But he was of course college educated. Henry studied probably with his father. There's always been suggestions that he may also have studied with his uncle, and that's possible as well. Initially, he started off with, I think, a small piece of a small farm, and at the place called Pine Slash, and of course the place burned. He was unsuccessful as a farmer, and one of the things that we now, historians now can recognize, is that the 1750s were a really bad time to be engaged in agriculture. Crops were failing regularly. That is, in fact, it's these droughts and the crop failures that occasion the passage of the Two-Penny Act of 1754 and then this Two-Penny Act of 1756, which are at issue in the Parsons Clause. So this is not a good time to try to get your start as a farmer. It's difficult enough for established farmers in the 1750s. So when that fails, he tries his hand at basically as a storekeeper. He and his brother try their hand as a storekeeper. Well, again, that's a difficult time in a period of crop failures and bad crops and essentially depression, because what was happening in Piedmont, Virginia, here in Hanover and in the upper counties, is that the tobacco marketing industry was basically being taken over by Scottish merchants based in Glasgow. And whereas in Tidewater they were still they had long established trade connections with merchants in London, but in the more Piedmont and frontier counties, a lot of the trade was with Scottish merchants who were sent out by companies based mostly in Glasgow, some in Edinburgh, and those guys had basically the credit backing of, it'd be like having you're sent out by a corporation, and so what happens to Henry and his brother is basically Virginia's economy at this point is all works on debt. It's all book debts. You accumulate debts, and then when the crop comes in, you sell it and you try to hope to make good. Well, they're in a position where basically they're competing against Scottish merchants who can survive extending credit. All they've got is what Dad can help with, and so as a result, he goes out of his attempts as a storekeeper go bad, and then he's moves in here at the tavern to help his wife's his father-in-law, and in the process of doing that, he's right across the street from the courthouse. He's mingling with lawyers and such, and so decides that he's going to try his hand at practicing the law. Reads law for a few. The stories change, but somewhere between six weeks and 6 months, and goes down to Williamsburg and is interviewed by the powers that be that have to okay a law license, and is successful, and then from that point on, just once he hangs out his shingle doing work in the county courts, he begins to thrive. The Parsons cause really is his transition into political life. Based on the Parsons cause, he gets elected to the House of Burgesses, and then it's when he's in the House of Burgesses that the Stamp Act suddenly arrives, and all of a sudden, the career is off. Does that help?
But thank you again for coming, and keep in mind, like I said, our gala event coming up, and you can check all that on our website. So thank you so much for supporting us.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. It was fun.